Welcome to the Loins of History, a podcast that connects history to the current events of today. In today's episode, we're going to continue on our series on the history of Chinese and U.S. relations. And for this episode, we're going to start taking a more U.S.-focused view of what was happening around this time. So for today's episode, what we're going to be discussing is what the U.S. policies were during this World War I warlord era and into the 1920s around China, and how that defined really international stances on the Chinese and what set up the Chinese Civil War and World War II. So Jay, with that being said, what are some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. This episode is going to cover two events. Well, two large categories of events on what kind of changed the dynamic between China, the U.S., and Japan. The first one being World War I. So we're going to kind of talk about what happened, how the U.S. played a role in negotiating territorial concessions, diplomatic policies between China and Japan. And then we're going to talk about what happened during the 1922 Washington Naval Conference that further kind of progressed the open door policy and things like that. So we got four key takeaways this episode. So the first one is just to kind of recap the open door policy from 1899 and why the U.S. Wanted to protect China from any imperialist power. Number two, so during World War I, the United States and Great Britain sacrificed its relationship with Japan in order to protect China and uphold the open door policy. Number three, the 1922 Washington Naval Conference, there was also what was called the Nine Power Treaty that was also signed, and it sought protections for China over the long term, and it was intended to codify the open door policy. But, you know, for all of you history nerds out there, 1922, we know, it's the interwar years. This did not protect China. But that's what we were trying to do. And then lastly, as kind of a point of summary, number four, the U.S. has always fought for a rules-based international order for really the last 100 years. And in the same way that the United States attempted to protect China from imperialism in the interwar years, that's still the policy of the United States today. And it kind of helps explain relations between the communist Chinese and the U.S. today.
In the previous couple episodes, we've mentioned the U.S. open door policy, dollar diplomacy, like you were saying. Can you kind of give a little bit of a recap of what some of those policies were leading up to this?
Yeah, so real quick before we get into World War I. So U.S. Secretary of State John Hay in 1899 wrote a letter to all the other imperial powers at the time: Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Netherlands, Portuguese, Spanish, all of them, Japan. And this is, if our listeners remember, this is a year prior to the Boxer Rebellion. So this is like at the pinnacle of Western imperialism in China, right before things went south with the Boxers. And he basically said, hey, it is the U.S. position that nobody do any more territorial concessions in China, that China be respected as an independent and sovereign country, and that y'all need to stop like carving up all these different spheres of influence. Hey, you're going to sign up this paper. That was basically this letter. And then he did get some responses. However, the responses were mostly like, well, we'll do it if the French agree to it, or we'll do it if the Brits agree to it. And they were all kind of waiting on everybody else to agree first, and nobody wanted to be the first one to agree, and it was basically ignored. However, that set the precedent. That was in 1899. So that's kind of the summary of the U.S. open door policy. I think there were both ideological and pragmatic aspects to it. The United States was heavily involved in the Philippines at this point in time. We were fighting the Philippine insurrection during this time. We had taken um, the Philippines from the Spanish, and we they were nominally an independent country, but they were a U.S. protectorate. And, one might accuse the United States of being fairly hypocritical from an ideological standpoint, saying like, well, you guys are literally killing Filipinos and they're just trying to be a free country. Now you're telling the rest of us that we need to leave the Qing dynasty alone. And that would be accurate. So there's a pragmatic aspect of, we knew that the U.S. also wanted trade, and we were trying to keep other people from having too much of a role in China. But from a popular opinion standpoint, like the Philippine insurrection was not popular in the United States. As a matter of fact, the United States took measures to kind of keep it out of the press as much as possible. I would even go so far as today to say that like it's not really taught in very many history textbooks. So popular opinion has pressured U.S. politicians to try to, hey, at that time the phrase self-determination was becoming popular, and Wilson really pushed it later in World War One. So that's anyway. I say all that to say that's kind of where we're at with the open door policy at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine these established world powers getting a letter from this upstart country that is suddenly becoming like very, we're basically new money at this point. We're new money, and we're trying to dictate to them what they can and can't do. But you're right, from a pragmatic standpoint, I go back to with what we mentioned, dollar diplomacy. It looks like they just wanted to make money, and they wanted to make sure that the money was flowing. And one thing that can stop that is unpredictable conflict, which seems to happen a lot. And they wanted to largely prevent some sort of European war in the Pacific and China that would interrupt business interests. And I think you're right. That's kind of been the policy and how we've handled things. The precedent was set there. So that's the open door policy, kind of a framing of how we viewed things with dollar diplomacy. And that leads into World War One. So I know China and Japan they had a small role in World War One, but what was going on during that time with the U.S. and China?
All right, so I think we talked in our last episode. Colin gave us a great history of the warlord era, and we talked about when the emperor abdicated in 1912, and Yuan Shikai took over the new Republic of China. Yuan Shikai was very much on sandy soil. He did not have a solid power base. He had his army, but when you have a dynasty that lasted several hundred years, I think the Qing came into power during the 1600s, and little less than 300 years later, your empire collapses and you've got a new, basically military dictator in charge. Things are super rocky. So it's 1914. Everything kicks off in August, which I will always give a shout out to Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. It is one of the best history books of all time. It is a fascinating story of how World War I got started. She doesn't really talk about what happens in Asia. That's not a criticism of the book, because the book doesn't have to talk about that. But it's really good. So it's August of 1914, and Great Britain is gearing up for war with the Kaiser in Germany, and the British, kind of similar to the United States today, had a alliance network. The whole reason why the Brits got involved in World War One was because Belgium was a protectorate of England, and the Germans who have been beefing with the French for hundreds of years. There's the Schlieffen Plan was going through Belgium to attack France. So the Brits get involved. Well, the Brits had a formal treaty alliance with Japan since 1902. And this is interesting because, we tend to focus on World War II, at least here in the United States. And we kind of get this impression that the West and Japan had always been enemies. But the reality is that Japan, as a growing imperial power, saw Korea as one of its main interests, and it saw China as one of its main interests, but it saw Russia as one of its main enemies. When Japan surveys the geopolitical landscape, it goes, who has similar interests? And Great Britain was like number one.
Well, they had the Western powers, specifically the British and Germans, come in and help them during the Meiji Restoration, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And from a British standpoint, if you don't necessarily get along with Russia, the Crimean War hadn't been too long ago. You've been playing the great game against Russia, which that's a fascinating thing in and of itself, where the Brits and the Russians were basically, the Brits had the British Raj in India, and Afghanistan became a point of friction, where just in Central Asia, we tend to not think of Central Asia as a big hot point between two quote unquote European powers. I hesitate to call Russia a European power, but they were fighting over Afghanistan, and there was like this decades long Cold War, sometimes hot war, between Great Britain and Russia. So they're not exactly friends at this point in time. So when Japan surveys the geopolitical landscape, they're like, yeah, we've got a lot in common with Great Britain. Great Britain never really had that much beef with Japan in the first place. It was the U.S. that showed up with gunboats and opened up Japan earlier in the 19th century. The Dutch and the Portuguese had previous trading relationships with Japan, but Japan very much saw Great Britain as an ally, and they formalized that in 1902. So when August of 1914 kicks off, the Brits go, hey, Germany had secured a very small colonial empire in the Pacific, and they had one treaty port in China.
Shandong.
Yeah, so the Shandong Peninsula, this area has come up quite a bit in our history here, but one of the major cities called Tsingtao or Qingdao, I think that's closer to how it's pronounced today, but Tsingtao was the one German treaty port. Like Hong Kong was the British one, Macau was the Portuguese one. The French had one, but I forget what it was called. And the Germans also had several islands. I think the Carolines were the big ones, kind of near Guam, north of Indonesia, east of the Philippines, kind of where, yeah, that's where the German islands were, that would become huge during World War II because the Japanese would build up a few different ports, Truk being one of them, where the Japanese would basically attack American and British and French islands and Australian interests during World War II. But this is how Japan got them. So Great Britain goes, hey, Japan, you're our ally, and there's some German stuff out there that's super vulnerable. Do you mind declaring war on Germany and helping us out? And of course, Japan at this point in time was like, heck yeah, we'll help you out. So in really just in a period of months, so by November of 1914, Japan occupied all of those German islands, and they did a very brief and successful siege against Tsingtao and occupied that city as well. So they had occupied, so it's November 1914, Japan occupies these Pacific Islands and the treaty port of Tsingtao. Well, the Western Front in Europe had kind of, solidified at this point. We'd entered trench warfare. Lots of people are dying. But from Japan's standpoint, they're like, all right, we kind of did our part here. And so they start thinking, we're technically at war. What else can we accomplish at this point? So in January of 1915, Japan starts getting a little squirrely. They send a list of 21 demands to Yuan Shikai in Beijing. And these 21 demands were super controversial. You can break them out into 5 different groups. So we're not going to talk about each of the demands individually, but you can break them out into 5 groups, and they're worth talking about a little bit just so we can kind of see how Japan viewed its role in the Asia and the Pacific at that time, and kind of what they were looking at doing in China. Remember, they were on the side of the Allies when they issued these demands. So they're friends with the Brits, the French, technically on the same side of the United States, even though the United States hadn't declared war at this point. But check this out. So the first group of demands essentially was a consolidation of Japanese control over Tsingtao and the entirety of the Shandong Peninsula. So they were like, hey, we're going to build railroads. We're going to formally cede Tsingtao to Japan. We're going to have like economic and tariff rights over all economic activity over the Shandong Peninsula, which again, just to recap for our listeners, the Shandong Peninsula is a significant area. Like a lot of Chinese people live there. It's not like a little corner. Hong Kong, when the Brits took it, there was not much going on in Hong Kong. Like the Shandong Peninsula is massive. A lot of people live there. It's a huge part of Chinese history. So this is major. The second and third categories of these demands basically either granted direct control or de facto control over Manchuria and parts of Mongolia. We kind of forget that Japan, we think of Siberia, what's now Russia, as this huge wasteland, but resources, even today, but especially back then, resources were huge. Like there were iron deposits in Manchuria, and they're looking for oil. They're looking for coal at this point in time. So they're like, Japan's eyeballing, like, if we can kind of claim sovereignty over not just Manchuria, but significant parts of Siberia, Mongolia, that would be a win for them. So that's what the second and third groups were trying to do that. The fourth was just one demand. The fourth category was just one demand, and it was kind of their own version of an open door policy. Well, it wasn't really an open door policy. Basically, the demand said, China, you will not make any further concessions to any other foreign powers. So it's kind of like, hey, you're not going to do anything for anybody else except for us. And then lastly, the fifth group, and by far the most controversial, was it required China to completely hand over all of its financial and policing powers for the entirety of the country over to Japan. So China would lose control of its money and its police force to Japan. And lastly, it would grant all of Fujian province to Japan. So by this time, Japan already, I think, Japan already controlled what was then called Formosa, now called Taiwan. Fujian is the province directly across the strait on mainland China from Taiwan. And they were like, hey, all of Fujian belongs to us. So, and Fujian is a huge, huge province. I think the now city of Xi'an is there. Huge city, extremely economically important to China.
So, Jay, the Japanese sent these to Yuan Shikai. What did the Chinese do in response to this list of demands and this sudden Japanese aggression to them?
Freaked out.
Well, I would expect a warlord to a strongman warlord like Yuan Shikai to kind of freak out about that. He's in a precarious position, remember?
Yeah, and they got wrecked by the Japanese not too long ago.
Yeah, in 1895.
During the first one. So yeah, he's on shaky ground. His health's probably not that great either at this point in time. I don't think he lives another year or two, but yeah, freak out. And somebody within the Chinese government decides, hey, we're going to publish these demands to the Brits and to the Americans and try to get them to help. Because you can imagine, like, again, Japan is an ally of Britain. Britain's big takeaway from the Boxer Rebellion was like, we don't want to be involved in this anymore. So they sent these demands to London and to Washington, and it totally worked. There was public outrage. Everyone was pissed off at the Japanese. And so the British and the Americans started pressuring Japan to back off. And a series of negotiations took place that really lasted, I think, over a year. Nothing was formalized until 1916. I think Japan was trying to capitalize on its weakness, on its newfound gains in China and in the Pacific. And they were kind of hoping that China would just capitulate, and that did not happen. So when the Brits and the Americans show up and they're like, yo, what are you doing? Japan was facing a lot of pressure. So
yeah, because you have to think that the Japanese probably assume, we're 50 years away from past the Meiji Restoration, but they probably perceive themselves as an equal power with the U.S. and Great Britain. And they probably look down on the Chinese because the Chinese, obviously the Qing dynasty just ended. Yuan Shikai, the new quote unquote president of the Republic of China, was one of the leaders of the Beiyang army against the Japanese when they fought in 1895. So the Japanese are probably looking at China as a very vulnerable and a great opportunity for them to expand. So when the British and the Americans come to them and tell them to stop, they're probably not too happy about that because they're going to look at the Western powers and say, hey, wait a minute. Great Britain, you have a massive empire. You occupy all these different countries. Hey, the U.S. has been doing this for years. Why can't we do this? I don't know. What do you think that what was the fallout of this, action by the U.S. and Britain to stop the Japanese?
The Japanese got pissed. To your point, they're like, wait a minute, we're not doing anything different than y'all, especially the British. Like y'all are over here demanding that we change while we are currently your allies. Like it's not even like we're on the side of the Germans here. We're on your side. And you're not letting us.
Hey, don't you occupy China currently? Also, it's got to be it's a very mixed message coming from the U.S. and Great Britain.
Right. So it's worth talking about who is the president of the United States at this point in time, and that's good old Woodrow Wilson. And if for those listeners that haven't listened to our history of political parties, we've got 2 episodes on that. That is, I think, listen to the second part 2 in that episode series because
I'm pretty sure it's more than 2 episodes. I'm pretty sure we did a couple of. I think we did a couple. We do talk about Woodrow Wilson. Listen to all.
Yeah, so like Woodrow Wilson is kind of an aberration in U.S. politics at this point in time. This is pre-FDR, so post-Civil War, pre-FDR. Republicans ran the show from Abraham Lincoln to the Great Depression, right before FDR took over. And Wilson is a Democrat. He's kind of an aberration at this point in time. So Woodrow Wilson, in terms of foreign affairs, was big on national self-determination. He believed that ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups, should be able to have their own state, and for those states who were already kind of ethno-linguistically homogenous.
Here's a quick quote on what he said about China. The awakening of the people of China to the possibilities under free government is the most significant, if not the most momentous event of our generation. So he clearly had an interest in Chinese self-determination.
Right. Whereas Republicans would have come at this from more of a business standpoint,
i.e. dollar diplomacy.
Yeah. Wilson was coming from a more ideological standpoint. I think it would be safe to say that, generally speaking, Republicans were the party of realpolitik, right? And Democrats were the more ideological backed government. Again, Henry Kissinger's book Diplomacy does a great job explaining kind of this dynamic, and Wilson's one of the people that he contrasts against Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt being the school of realpolitik.
Kind of ironic.
Wilson,
because Teddy Roosevelt is really the reason that Woodrow Wilson got elected. He ran as a third party at the Bull Moose Party. So it's a little bit of irony there.
Definitely a little bit of irony. So Wilson, when these 21 demands get published, Woodrow Wilson's in office. And it's like, from China, it was a really smart move to make, because it was the right time in the United States to kind of go, whoa, we're going to double down on the open door policy here, and we're going to try to pressure the Japanese to stop pressuring the Chinese. So, long story short, the fifth group of demands, the ones that basically ceded control of their government to Japan and Fujian province, the Japanese withdrew those demands, but they kept the rest of them. So I think it brought it down to 13 demands. And Yuan Shikai signed the document in 1916. So they had control over Shandong, much larger control in Manchuria, formally ceded Tsingtao to the Japanese, and the Japanese kind of were like this, hey, we're now the power that gets to have a huge say in Japanese politics. It's also worth mentioning, before we talk about kind of the fallout from this agreement, was after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. If we remember, Japan took the Liaodong Peninsula, then known as under Russian control as Port Arthur. They took it from Russia, and the international community pressured Japan to give it back. And
specifically, Teddy Roosevelt was the one mediating that. So he was actually the one doing a lot of the negotiation, and he specifically pressured them. So
right. So this is not the first time the international community has made Japan give up some of its claims in the area, and Japan is pissed. So their big lesson learned from the end of this was, we cannot trust the West. We have to become more powerful than the West so that we can advance our interests unilaterally. This is a dangerous conclusion.
I was going to say,
for a country to come to.
Jay, with that in mind, is there? And this is we're going off script here, but
no, let's do it.
Taking a look with all that in mind, that okay, the Japanese come to the conclusion that they need to become so powerful that no one can tell them that they can't do something. Could that have been in your opinion, do you think that that could have been changed had the U.S. and Great Britain and some of the other Western powers approached this differently? Or do you think that that was just going to happen no matter what?
With the people that were in control of Japan at the time, I think that was going to happen no matter what. Because to be 100% honest, like you from an American standpoint, I don't fault China, the U.S., or Great Britain for pressuring Japan to give it up. Like, again, that's why we brought up Woodrow Wilson. Like, Woodrow Wilson was motivated by ideology more so than pragmatic, stuff. Like he was a Presbyterian. He was a professor at Princeton. Like, he was a theological man and an academic man. He wasn't like, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, like blood for oil type dude. Like, he was the antithesis to that. Right. So, in which just talking about it, it sounds right. Like, that sounds ideologically correct. And it was just kind of like, the fates were decided, the wheel of history, the wheel of time was turning such that, if Japan's posture was just aggressive expansion, then yeah, like, you're gonna create conflict. And I don't know what the US or Great Britain, or even China for that matter, could have done differently to convince Japan. Like, Japan was on a collision course. They'd already been on a collision course. They'd already fought one war with China, one war with the Russians, completely wrecked both of them. And if you're Great Britain and the United States, you're going, we're next. So we've got to stop them doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I think with this, once the Meiji Restoration was successful and they were able to essentially become an imperial power without a really, the end of a dynasty, like the Chinese failure to become a power, I think that was when it was set. So I think this is a logical conclusion to events that started decades prior. So yeah, I tend to agree with you there. I also think your Wheel of Time, Wheel of History reference was like an amalgamation of a Robert Jordan book and a Mussolini quote.
Yeah, well, we're all about amalgamations here in the Loins of History. Yeah. So it's funny you asked that. What I thought you were going to ask was, is China now in the same position?
That was going to be my follow-up.
And the answer to that question is abso-freaking-lutely. Japan or China, the communist Chinese concluded long ago that we have to be stronger than everybody else. And in order to get what we want, communist China, from hey, this is what we're trying to accomplish as a nation, in my humble opinion, is in the exact same spot that the Japanese were during this time frame. They're like, we are a great nation. We have our interests, and we're going to accomplish them come hell or high water. So it is a path for conflict no matter what you do.
I also think we're getting a little ahead on some of what's going to happen, but I think if you look at the history of the Communist Party within China, they definitely got beat up quite a bit in their early days. We talked about the Shanghai Massacre and the Long March and their conflicts of breaking out of the encirclement campaign. So let's bring it back, though, to these events. So Japan's pissed. They're on a collision course with the U.S., say the West, but specifically the U.S. World War I ends. Yuan Shikai signed these. He dies. If we remember from last week's episode, he dies in 1916. The warlord era begins here, and it is chaos in China.
Right.
What is happening right now around China that is going to affect them?
Yeah. So after these list of 13 Demands. If anybody, I think it's the movie American History X. They kind of make this joke of Moses coming off the mountain and he had like the 15 commandments, and he was trying to hold like 3 different tablets in his hands, and he was like, kind of juggling it, and he drops one and it kind of shatters on the ground. He goes, I have these 15. And it's like, and he's like, 10 commandments.
It was 100% not American History X. American History X is about a neo-Nazi.
What movie was that?
It sounds like...
Edit that part out. What movie am I thinking of?
It's a Mel Brooks. I know it's a scene from a Mel Brooks movie, so I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I know exactly.
Right, I'm really bad with movies, folks.
Yeah, I'll edit the American History X part. It's like, where is he going? Where is Jay going with this one?
No. He's like, I have these 15. 10 commandments. Like, that's Japan. It's like, we have these 21, 13 demands.
So the Paris Peace Conference.
Sorry. Yeah. In World War I, we kind of think of it like, oh, the Treaty of Versailles was signed and everything's hunky-dory. It was not hunky-dory. So really from 1919... which is when Treaty of Versailles, the Paris Peace Conference was taking place. From 1919, for the next 3 years, there's unrest. Like Con said, warlord era is breaking out. China is fracturing. Well, the Shandong Peninsula is not accepting Japanese control over this area. Like, this is Chinese heartland, and it's not going well for Japan. So one of the things that was big time hurting Japan was the Chinese were boycotting all Japanese goods. So they were not buying anything from Japan, and which was basically ruining the Japanese business interest in the Shandong Peninsula at that time. There was riots and unrest, disobedience going on in Tsingtao in particular. So fast forward to 1922, we have the Washington Naval Conference. So the United States is like, we just want peace, love, and harmony in the world. And let's bring in all the big powers. We're going to primarily talk about limiting this naval arms race because we've got these big, scary ships, the dreadnoughts of World War One. We're going to try to limit this naval arms race to try to prevent conflict. Well, another slight to Japan during this time was everything was kind of based on Great Britain. The United States and Great Britain were allowed to have a certain a number of capital ships, and it was kind of built off of tonnage of each ship. But Japan was not allowed to have the same size navy. It wasn't like, hey, we're all equal. It was like Japan had like a 2/3 or a 3/4 limit of the size of the British and the American navies. And they're like, what the heck? Why can't we have as big of a navy as y'all? The Italians were also a party and couldn't have the same size navy. And yeah, so that's kind of the discussions that were going on at this time. Well, on the side of the Washington Naval Conference, the Americans were trying to mediate between the Japanese and the Chinese. On the side... the U.S. is on the side of the Washington Naval Conference. The U.S. is trying to mediate between Japan and China, specifically on the Shandong Peninsula and what's going on with Tsingtao. And just to kind of give an illustration of where the State Department, who is doing these negotiations, where they're kind of at, here's a quote from a letter that an American diplomat in what was called the Far East Office he wrote a letter to then Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, which for all of our American history folks, this is the same William Jennings Bryan who did the Cross of Gold speech. You will not crucify us on a cross of gold. Talking about the gold standard at that time when he was running for office. William Jennings Bryan was a very charismatic figure. He didn't get elected, so he's kind of forgotten in senses. But anyway, this is not him, but in a letter to him as the Secretary of State, this is what the diplomat said. Our present commercial interests in Japan are greater than those in China, but the look ahead shows our interest to be a strong and independent China rather than one held in subjection by Japan. China has certain claims upon our sympathy. If we do not recognize them, as we refuse to recognize Korea's claim, we are in danger of losing our influence in the Far East and of adding to the dangers of the situation. So the United States knew, is like, hey, we've got to go to bat for China, unlike how we're not going to bat for Korea in this exact same situation. Because even though we have greater commercial interests in Japan, we need to manage the rise of Imperial Japan because the situation is getting dangerous for us, for the United States, and just the West writ large. So, say all that to say, we negotiate a compromise between China and Japan at the Washington Naval Conference. And this compromise becomes the 1922 Nine-Power Treaty. So we got, everybody was there in Washington. We got 9 total powers to sign off on this bad boy. And essentially the Nine-Power Treaty codified the open door policy. As an aside, what was called the Shandong Treaty, the Shandong Treaty was between China and Japan. It gave control of Tsingtao back to China. So Japan kind of walked away, and the Chinese then they got control of Shandong and Tsingtao back. But the open door policy and the Nine-Power Treaty got codified, and it was kind of like the culmination of, if we remember John Hay's letter, when he's like, hey, can you all sign something with me? And nobody did it. The Nine-Power Treaty is when they formally did. The problem, it is, again, the history nerds know, like, this is 1922. Everything was not hunky-dory after this.
I was going to say, is it kind of like the League of Nations where it's sort of like, hey, yeah, we're all part of this, but there's not really an enforcement mechanism. There's not really a way to even inspect and, any punishment in case you don't uphold your end of the agreement.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly it. There was no enforcement mechanism. There was no rules about how sanctions can be imposed, etc. It was literally just a statement of intent and goodwill. Like, we all agree, of which Japan was part of the Nine-Power Treaty, like, hey, we're not going to interfere with China. Well, 9 years later, so in 1931, Japan further invades Manchuria, and which broke the treaty of 1922, and nobody really did anything because there was nothing that they could do. Some sanctions were imposed, but these statements of like, we're not going to continue to take over this territory largely fell on deaf ears.
I think it's interesting to look at. You're right, because in 1931, if we look at what's going on in the world, Calvin Coolidge is still the president of the U.S., who is very isolationist. He's also in the midst of the Great Depression. So the sanctions that we're talking about and like military action is just not feasible right now. So if the Japanese were to pick a time to do this was actually probably a pretty good time, because no one in this Nine-Power Treaty was going to actually do anything about it because they had their own problems to worry about. And by the way, they're still only 13 years away from the end of World War I. So it's not like they had an appetite for conflict.
And I think Hoover was president.
Oh, yeah, Hoover. Yeah, Coolidge was president from 21 to 29, and then
right before Hoover.
Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like, there was no appetite in the international community, and especially the United States, to do anything militarily against Japan. Honestly, like it is very similar to today. So this is the connecting history to today part of the show. Like the United States has been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, all over the Middle East. We've got troops deployed globally, doing all kinds of stuff. And when Russia invades the Ukraine, there is zero appetite to do anything militarily, just from a domestic standpoint. Like, we don't want to do anything. So all we can do is talk a really big game and do economic sanctions, which are working depending on who you talk to. That's not the point of this episode, but it's a similar time in that you have an aggressive power who smells weakness within the international community, and they're going to do what they want to do. And it doesn't matter how many chastisements you put in the press or how hard you slap their wrist with economic sanctions. Like, they're willing to take big risks in order to further their natural interests. And those risks are coming from a position of, we've been wronged by this international community. That is Russia today. That is China today. That is Iran today. That is North Korea today. Like, there's a lot of parallels between what was going on in the 19 teens, the 1920s, the early 30s to where we're at today, 100 years later.
So, Jay, you mentioned earlier in the episode the U.S. policies in China have been fairly consistent. Like, can you elaborate on that a little bit with all this being said?
Yeah. So, again, kind of thinking about today, the United States, President Biden has been adamant, and he's publicly said multiple times that in the event of a military conflict, the United States will defend Taiwan. The Chinese look at that and go, this is a departure from the status quo, because, and this is a future episode, we absolutely will dig into these details on what the U.S. one China policy looks like and how that came to be. But China sees, those comments and American, intent to defend Taiwan as a breaking of the status quo. Hey, you guys have this one China policy. But if you look at the greater historical context here, in the same way that the U.S. saw China as its own independent country, and Japan was trying to infringe upon that, we were willing to damage our relationship with Japan. Japan, I've said this, I don't know how many times in this episode, but Japan was an ally of Great Britain and was thus friendly with the United States during this time. We did not have an adversarial relationship with Japan. It was more of like a competition over influence, and war between Japan and the United States was not inevitable at this point in time. But when the United States started defending China from the Japanese standpoint, it did become, war between our two countries did become inevitable. Like, the seeds of Pearl Harbor were sown in 1922. So, math in public, 19, I think, years earlier, we were on a slow moving train wreck towards one of the bloodiest conflicts in all of history. So, and ultimately led into the explosion of 2 atomic bombs in Japan. Like, it's kind of like this is not something to be taken lightly. And from a policy standpoint today, from just a historical standpoint today, like, these decisions have consequences. So in the same way today, like, our position that China should not and will not militarily invade Taiwan, like, those positions have consequences. And if China is willing to double down on where they're at today in the U.S., which I think we are, and again, this is kind of irrespective of who's in office at any given point in time, regardless if you're a Republican or Democrat here in the United States, like we've more or less consistently said, hey, if we're going to defend you, this is in our interest. We're going to do it. South Korea is another example. At the risk of ranting, Ukraine, if anything, Ukraine is the exception, not the rule, where, usually the United States has kind of been a little bit more aggressive in defending other countries.
No, that's a good point, and we're about to go off script again. So, ideologically speaking, because Woodrow Wilson was an ideologue, and he was a true believer in some of his policies. You mentioned earlier that the CCP has long understood that they're going to have to be stronger in order to break off the shackles of what they deem as some unjust policies that they've been forced to abide by. Could the U.S. have affected the trajectory of the Chinese? Because we're going to get it right now. We're kind of in this warlord transitioning into the Civil War, the break between the nationalists and the communists. Could we have done anything differently in the 1920s to alter the trajectory of the country? Do you think, in your opinion?
Sorry, alter the trajectory of which country?
China.
Japan or China? What do you mean? Like,
well, because right now, like we mentioned, we're looking at it as a business interest. We're extremely isolationist. In 1927, the nationalists betrayed the CCP and they split. Is there anything we could have done differently? Because I know the Germans were involved with the German military mission and the nationalists. The Soviets were mass exporting communist ideology to China and had a great influence on the Chinese people at an ideological level. Meanwhile, the U.S. is simply trying to protect business interests. Do you think we could have done anything different that might have swayed the outcome of that civil war a little differently?
Swayed it more in our favor?
Yeah.
No. So, and this is the thing. I'm so glad we have as many non-U.S. people listening to our podcast as we do, because the U.S. is unique. And one of the things that we're unique in is our government doesn't intentionally export ideology. As a matter of fact, the only time that I can think of off the top of my head when we've even attempted was after the invasion of Iraq and we toppled Saddam Hussein and the Baathists. It was kind of like, we're going to export democracy now.
You guys want some of that democracy?
Yeah. Which was an epic failure. The way in which America exports its ideology is through the more or less private sector. So during this time in China, there were a butt ton of American missionaries there. The government, to my knowledge, like, it's not like the government was sending them. Like, we're Protestants. There is no, establishment of religion over here. I say we're Protestants. By and large, the United States is the majority. There's tons of Catholics and non-Protestants around. Sorry, didn't mean to say that we're a Protestant country. Rather, ideologically speaking, like, we're, the country doesn't belong, like, we don't submit to the Pope. So from that standpoint, like, Protestant ideology is that, you're kind of free to do what you want, religiously speaking. Like, there were missionaries on their own free will going to China. So that was exporting our ideology. And we talked about how that impacted Sun Yat-sen. We talked about how that impacted the Taiping Rebellion. Business interests. I mean, I think I said in an earlier episode, Hollywood is the greatest example of American imperialism today, right? Like, Hollywood shapes cultures. I was fortunate enough to take a trip to India several years ago, and it was mind-blowing how many Indians I ran into that were like, I love Taylor Swift. Like, no, like, love her. like if she was here right now, I'd marry her type deal. And they like the messages that Taylor Swift puts in her songs and in her social media posts are hugely influential. The U.S. government's not telling Taylor Swift to do that. That's just Taylor Swift being Taylor Swift. So movies, Tom Cruise, like so many foreigners want to be Tom Cruise. They they watch Mission Impossible, which, for our British listeners, James Bond is 10 times better than Mission Impossible.
Blasphemy.
I freaking love James Bond.
Blasphemy. Yeah. And it's called soccer, not football.
Yeah.
I tend to agree with you.
We can have a little give and take.
I tend to agree with you. I always use the Vietnam.
The point being is that's what they want to be like.
Yeah, I was going to say I always use the Vietnam example. We lost the war in Vietnam, but there's a McDonald's in major cities that we've lost wars in. And anyway,
yeah. To kind of wrap all that up is no, I don't think we could have done anything any differently because we weren't trying to intentionally control, our influence in the first place. So I don't know what we would have done. We would have had to have become something that we were not, an authoritarian state that controls every aspect of society in order to alter how we were influencing China at that time. So what I thought you were going to ask, and just kind of a final point here, specifically with regards to China and Taiwan, thinking about the collision course that the United States and Japan were on after 1922, the U.S. and China are on a collision course right now. And frankly, I don't see how things can change in China, and I don't see how things could change here in the United States. The only variable that I could see is Taiwan itself. Right now, President Tsai is part of, I think it's called the Liberal Democratic Party, and they are the party that favors independence from China the most. The Kuomintang, the KMT, is still around. They're actually the party that kind of wants to keep the status quo and not piss off China too much. Interestingly enough, because they're the ones that fought the Civil War with the CCP. But the President Tsai is not the person that the CCP wants in office right now. And if, in the long term, her party continues to win re-elections, that's consistent with the collision course. And from the U.S. standpoint here, we have always said, and this is consistent with our one China policy, that Taiwan and China has to work out its differences between the two of them. And that China is not, we do not support China, Communist China, from using its military influence to try to annex Taiwan or anything like that. So, the only way that this could get peacefully resolved is if Taiwan and China is able to work out their differences, not if the U.S. decides to not defend Taiwan. I don't think that'll change. Conflict will still happen if Taiwan wants to remain independent at that time. So I guess I say all that to say it's not us, it's them.
It's not me, it's you.
Yeah.
No, that's really good. So Jay, this is a great series. That was a great episode, and it really kind of put some things in perspective, comparing what was happening, at World War I, post World War I into the 1920s, and really paralleling it to what's going on right now. And it's kind of a dangerous thought to think that we might be on a collision course with another large superpower in China. So everyone, if you're enjoying listening to these episodes, we hope you are, and we really appreciate you listening. If you have any feedback for us, please engage with Jay and I on social media. Leave us a review. You can ask us questions online. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict. You can interact with us directly there. Or like we said, we're on social media. Pretty much the handles are Loins of History or some very small variation of that. We're trying to get a little bit more active, but we do answer messages, and we do try and participate in the history community online. And like we said, please leave us a review. It helps the algorithm, so moves us to the top, helps us get the word out. And we do appreciate all the listeners. And for next week, we're going to continue on this series about the U.S. and Chinese relations and really start to get into the nationalist takeover of the country and the falling out and conflict between the CCP and the Kuomintang. So with that being said, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.